What is happening with Final Fantasy XIV? Is the game dead? Dying? Is the game falling apart? Not really, but a significant amount of players and non-players would probably want you to think so. I know I myself criticize the game's faults a lot too, but this time I would like to discuss some of these seemingly hopeless perspectives and maybe breathe some hope back into things. So let's discuss. LuckyBancho. Effectively, since the very beginning of 14's existence, LuckyBancho has been roughly tracking the player count of the game, through things like achievement counts and gear changes to determine whether a character is actively being played. It is very possible that the graph is effectively only counting a percentage of the actual players, but it is still tracking, at the very least, a consistent percentage of the player base. Early on in Dawntrail, this graph observed the greatest dip in player count the game ever had, and many players saw this as an omen that the game was going to die real soon, which, of course, was also partly because those individual players also either quit or felt like it, and for some reason, a lot of gamers seemingly would prefer if a game they loved or enjoyed once dies as they leave it behind, to avoid the possibility they miss out by quitting. Looking over the rest of the graph, each expansion has seen a steady jump in player count increase over the previous, with a dip in the middle of the expansion that then rises again at the end. The exception where the end dwarfed the beginning was Shadowbringers, which did so, at least partly, due to no fault of 14 itself. First, the whole world shut down, leading to one of, if not the greatest gaming boom ever, which obviously also affected 14. Then, a bit later, World of Warcraft floundered so hard that the event known as the WoW Exodus happened, where players left in droves, and indeed, 14 was one of the closest games in gameplay to WoW, causing a massive boom in player count. And then Endwalker released, the grand finale of the decade-long story. But despite this, notice that the player count gradually stagnated here too. The world opened up again, and players eventually returned to the game they came from. Some players who had stuck to the game for this decade-long story probably also quit since the story was over. That was it. And then, right at the end of Endwalker, the spike we normally see is there, and then it dipped back to where it was, and then kept falling, gradually. At present, the graph appears to be evening out to a more stable player count, but if you got into 14 during the WoW Exodus, or at Endwalker's launch, or you got used to that player count, we now have about 2/3 of that player count. This is felt more on smaller data centers as the drop made room on the bigger data centers and some players moved there, with I imagine the most extreme case being Dynamis, the NA data center added around a year into Endwalker that nowadays many players would probably say is completely redundant. Those players could fit between Primal and Crystal at the very least. However, with all that said, despite the massive loss of player count and all that, 14's current player count appears to hang around the numbers it had before the world shut down. And assuming the graph doesn't start free-falling more, that is actually not that bad. We had some events collide that gave 14 way more attention than it ever had, it released its grand story finale, and then things went back to normal. World of Warcraft plus game too easy, quote unquote. A result of the A Realm Reborn design process is that 14 has always been compared quite closely with WoW. This also means that whenever one of the games has something good the other doesn't, it is seen as some sort of weakness. I'd say the point where 14 really started to be noticed in this way was with the release of Ultimates, intended as the hardest raids in the game. That said, what makes difficult content difficult in WoW and what makes it in 14 is somewhat different. 14 likes to focus on structured, so-called dance fights, and most mechanics are consistent enough and have few enough moving parts that you can account for and learn every pattern you may need from memory. These fights are also designed with the direct intention that they are beatable with the game as it is. You don't need mods to help, and you don't need an ultra-wide monitor to give you a wider view. What's with that anyway? Although, they both definitely help. WoW, on the other hand, embraces chaos much more and allows players to have far more varied party compositions as needed, adding more or less healers and tanks if need be, handling weird edge case scenarios and whatnot. But even when WoW tried to dial back the heavy use of add-ons, mods, it was still considered necessary. In 14, outside of maybe a few exceptions, the raid boss is released as is, and either you can beat it or you can't. Many months after, Echo is added as an option to give you an edge, while also offering the option to turn it off if you like, so you can still experience the boss at its prime within reason, of course. Additionally, these bosses are usually tuned to be beatable in like roughly crafted gear and maybe 1 or 2 drops or something like that. So, you know, that also helps over the course of a raid tier. In WoW, a new raid tier has the bosses gradually increase in difficulty, requiring higher item level as you go, meaning that often the final few bosses expect that you all got some gear from the raid itself to beat it. Additionally, it is commonly released vastly overtuned to add to the spectacle of the world first race, and is then nerfed permanently over time, meaning the version of the fight you maybe saw is nowhere near as tough as the version you and I will actually get to fight. With good reason, considering the boss was deliberately made too strong. Naturally, when 14 doesn't do that, it makes it difficult to serve a strong enough challenge for players that made it their professional job to defeat it. Expanding a bit to more casual content like dungeons, we can again see how WoW emphasizes the greater difficulty. A leveling dungeon commonly gets also a heroic difficulty. Nowadays, that's basically just the max level version. Mythic difficulty, aka hard mode, and then Mythic Plus, which is, well, let's just say that even Mythic dungeons by today's standards aren't that hard, so they added an infinitely scaling version with a timer on it. By comparison, 14 has just the one difficulty. It would be great to see proper hard mode versions of 14 dungeons, but admittedly, at times it does make a lot more sense that development focuses their attention on boss fights, considering how much better the jobs we have are designed around dealing with that nowadays. Speaking of which, jobs aren't as interesting as they used to be. Back in, I'd say around Stormblood, jobs had more options than today's jobs. Tanks had 2 different stances to optimize with. DPS and healers often had more weird or confusing or complicated options. For instance, Ninja had abilities that helped manage enmity for other players as a unique feature. However, many of these things were removed or changed due to not adding much positive value when it really comes to it. It might also be for balance reasons. Anyway, for example, I'd argue that there are far more players of MMOs that find enmity management more just annoying than interesting, because most of the time it means what someone else does or doesn't do may dictate what you have to do or aren't allowed to do, and it sows chaos, especially with players that don't care. Another example is the tanks stances thing. One stance made you tankier and made enmity easier, while the other made you do more damage. In a way, the tankier stance was the training wheels, while the other sort of became what you're actually meant to be doing. If a savage boss is balanced around the assumption that you use the damage stance, then using the tank stance might make the DPS check too hard, which sort of makes the existence of the tank stance pointless. If, on the other hand, the fight is instead balanced around the assumption you use the tank stance, it is possible that if the tank then uses the damage stance instead, the DPS check becomes too easy. Instead of needing to try and balance around both options, they were just merged together to reduce the amount of moving parts. Criticism I've seen leveled at 14 somewhat frequently is that due to the sheer amount of buttons and strictness of rotations, even if they aren't that complicated, newer players especially feel like the game wants the jobs to be unnecessarily complicated, like piloting a spaceship or something. And over the course of Endwalker and Dawntrail, a lot of the bigger simplifications jobs have received have most definitely reduced this feeling. Some jobs have gotten more flexible as a result, with a knock-on effect of making the most complex parts of mastering the job redundant, which of course sucks, but we can't just keep piling onto the same stack, and perhaps making some major changes to try something else may end up being for the better in the long run. On this one, I guess we'll have to see with 8.0, but I will also add that at least some frustrations originate from exploring and learning more and more about a game and eventually running out of things to learn, and then, as the game continues to progress, it feels like it removes things you learned instead of adding something new for you to master. Rewards suck and gear doesn't matter. Both of these problems here are topics that especially started to gain prominence around Endwalker and yet more in Dawntrail, and considering gear sometimes is the reward, they are somewhat intertwined. Where it gets odd is that rewards haven't actually changed that much over the years. I think where the rewards suck angle got its spotlight was when content that actually required gear to begin with didn't offer any itself, starting with Criterion back in Endwalker. For comparison, challenging content like the Lubrum Regine Savage or Baldesian Arsenal gives gear that makes that specific content easier. And if you didn't happen to be a Savage Raider at the time, the gear itself was likely an upgrade of what you already had too. Meanwhile, Criterion sort of required you to already have Savage gear, but only gave cosmetic rewards. For the gear side of the conversation, I know for a fact this was the case in Stormblood, but may have been the case in Heavensward or even A Realm Reborn. Other gearing options didn't matter. For the hardest content, you get yourself some crafted gear to get started, and then build up with tome gear and raid drops, maybe supplemented by an extreme weapon. Other options didn't compare. Crit was always the best, right after enough accuracy back when that was a thing. Piety, parry and tenacity was generally considered not needed, and speed was typically worse than determination and direct hit when it came into play, making gearing and stats a pretty whatever affair. Because of the way content syncs you, getting better gear is not that important for most players, as the newest casual content is already overwhelmed by a crafted set. So only if you do something harder than that is gear relevant, and only if you do the most recent Savage Raids, or Extremes, or I guess Ultimates, may the gear feel necessary. The positive here is that if you prefer to focus on the fights themselves, and not so much on the gear numbers and whatnot, it seems like in large part, you're meant to be allowed to do that in 14. It doesn't change the fact that gear feels a bit pointless though, doesn't it? Although it seems this was always the case, this just became more obvious as players started trying to optimize more and more and found that there wasn't that much depth to begin with. Jank is still here a decade after it should have been fixed. This one, I think, is understandable to be frustrated by, and I have indeed made videos going over various jank the game has for this or that reason, ranging from how ridiculous the netcode sometimes is, to buff caps, to other random bits and bobs. That said, we have recently and throughout Dawntrail seen some things we have waited for or wanted for a long time finally come through. Better late than never, right? Chat bubbles were made native to the game, the strategy board finally released and works and is amazing for sharing memes. It also works for sharing strategies, just not a lot of people do that. Any job being allowed to glam any equipment also finally was added, although it did come at a cost. Being allowed to hoard every piece of glamour you ever see is something players have asked for a long time, and while that was often dismissed as impossible, the outfit glamours added in 7.1 is gradually getting expanded to cover more and more gear, giving us a way to cram way more items into less space, which, while not perfect and not exactly what was asked for, is progress on yet another thing players asked for so long. Which is to say, maybe, just maybe, now that 16 isn't being made simultaneously also, I don't know what else, many of the janky pieces of 14 might finally get ironed out, as things are at least happening. The game is spreading too thin. This is a feeling some players might have had over the years due to various types of content getting very little attention, and those that do get attention might sometimes feel shallow. The biggest flag on this concern came with the reveal that Beastmaster is finally getting released, while the awaited and promised, might I add, Blue Mage update was postponed. My most hopeful perspective on this, which really require me to dig deep here, is maybe Blue Mage gets an update early on in the next expansion, and then again at the normal time they get updated. This might also make sense, as they could sort of alternate updates for Blue Mage and Beastmaster a bit until they're both caught up or something. That could be fantastic. Now, do I actually believe this will happen? Well, considering how many times I've expected one thing and gotten another, I think the best we can do is be sad for our Blue Mage gamers in the present and then be excited for the potential early update when we see it. The game is dead! A bit of a reiteration of the first point of the video, but something funny about the MMO genre as a whole, and at times the whole of gaming, likes to stamp things as dead long before they are, as if there's some sort of prestige in having called it first. Many MMOs have been deemed dead by players and lived on for a long time since, and in fact, if social media is to be believed, MMO as a genre is already dead. Remember, having 2/3 of your peak player base doesn't mean dead. Not being in your prime doesn't mean you're dead. And finally, PR man YoshiP himself. A surprising amount of players will be so far in the negative when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV that they will have quit quite a while ago and be telling their friends and anyone that would listen that maybe they should do the same, only to flip back to liking the game again after a hopeful enough sounding live letter with YoshiP. What tends to happen a while later then is that they are reminded why they quit, and those things may not have been solved, changed, or fixed. So, to sort of round off this kind of hopeful, it isn't as bad as it all might seem discussion, I do want to remind you that YoshiP is fantastic at PR, and to maybe take 5, review what is promised, and think about how exciting that actually is, because I believe some of these players have this pendulum effect of loving and hating the game, may at least be partly because they come back with excitement and are then reminded of how things actually are, and then swing back in the opposite direction. If you jump back into 14 with a more mellow level of expectations, maybe it will be easier to stick around, either to find new joy in the content you liked before, or to find something new to enjoy. But what do you think? Something new coming to 14 that you are really looking forward to? Some content that you enjoy, maybe despite it being left a bit in the dust? Or maybe you're playing a different game to fill the void of a particular type of content you enjoy while you wait for 14 to catch up? I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, with the release of Endwalker, the combo timer was extended from 15 seconds to 30. This timer extension has become relevant for maintaining combos between bursts, especially on Reaper, Machinist, Viper, and Gunbreaker, and Paladin's current rotation doesn't really work without it. On top of that, jobs like Ninja, Dancer, and even Warrior and Dark Knight would have trouble maintaining their combos going across bursts on just 15 measly seconds.